Yes, Guyana to the world.
Globespan is a Guyanese dialogue moving towards the realization of one nation in one Guyana. It's a platform that offers an all-inclusive discussion with the pros, the cons, the ones that is taken aside, and the ones that stand in the middle. Globespan believes agreeing and disagreeing are part of the nation's building.
She is a beauty, beautiful Guyana, with wonderful people all over this country.
Globespan believes every Guyanese voice is part of the nation's building. As we span the globe for voices from the diaspora and those living home, we stand on our commitment that we are all Guyanese working towards one nation in one Guyana. As the world turns on its axis bringing changes, we as Guyanese must adapt to those changes for a better Guyana for all. Globespan stands on its axis with its belief that one nation, one Guyana, one destiny must include voices from all corners of Guyana.
With many flavor, 6 different people blended together. Raise your flag high in unity, we're family with one destiny. Raise your flag high in unity.
And listeners to another edition of Globespan with Mr. Devin Bissoon as our technical guide. We are discussing ethnic relationship, and ethnic racial rhetoric in Guyana. This is an election year. We'll have an election sometime for November, and a lot of these racial rhetoric, ethnic rhetoric, will be in use, has been in use. So we will be in this subject. Before we do that, let me introduce the panelists for tonight: Professor Dr. Betoram Ramarak, Dr. Terence Campbell. It's the first time I am engaging Campbell on this program anyway. I don't recall if ever I engaged in a written Guyana newspapers. He may have a better memory than me, as I'm aging and losing my memory anyway. Mr. Vincent Sander and Ravindra Dev. Again, apart from Mr. Dr. Terence Campbell, the others are well known. So Dr. Terence Campbell, welcome. Welcome to Globespan 24/7. I don't know if this is your first program here, but if it is, please join us more regularly, more routinely, more often. And thank you for taking time off, all of you gentlemen. The wonderful edition of Globespan 24/7 Ethnic Relationship in Ghana. I will ask Professor Dr. Betoram Ramarak if he may put an introduction of this subject. Why is it important? Why are we discussing this? That I do want New York City. By the way, Dr. Ramarak and I went to school together. At although some people felt I, at any rate, university and don't have a degree, so that's quite all right. And Dr. Ramarak has written some. Among them is Alice Bagundai, that won the second prize in the Guyana literature last year. Dr. Ramarak, before you discuss this ethnic relationship introduction, could you tell us a little about Alice Bagundai and the second prize that the book won last year?
Well, I don't want to sound like a salesperson, but Alice was married to a person by the name of Jang Bahadur Singh, who was a ship doctor. But Alice was actually born in Suriname, and they got married in 1910. She came to Guyana, and she had been very much involved in the cultural aspect of Guyana. So there was an organization called the British Guyana Dramatic Society, which she formed, and they were engaged in producing plays for about 10 years from 1937. She was also very much involved, as I said, in promoting Indian culture. She worked with her husband very closely to do cultural work that benefited Indians, and she was pretty much involved in almost every major social organizations that existed during her time. So that was Alice Bagundai Singh.
Right. And Dr. Ramharak and the other speakers as well, if you could try to be as brief as possible when speaking, so that we can have several rounds of discussion on this very important topic. With introduction of this topic, Diane.
Well, Fish, your voice has been breaking up, so I don't know if it's just me or the others.
Dr. Bisram, can you talk a little bit louder?
So, ethnic relationship in Guyana. You may begin with an introduction now, Dr. Ramharak.
Well, well, a couple of things. One, I mean, I don't want to get into a whole, spiel here, but I think we always try to make, this program, at least when I'm on, to make it connect to what's happening in Guyana. And of course, folks who are living in Guyana are the ones who are going to solve the problems that are in Guyana. So when we talk about, this whole notion of rhetoric is important, right? And I think we develop a kind of a language, a rhetoric, so to speak, words and so on, slogans, stereotypes, all based on essentially two things. One is the historical experience we've had, right? So, for instance, we may choose to use some words that go back to the colonial experience, right? So that's one kind of influence. And I think the second influence in our language has to do with our own cultural experience. We all have our own language, our own history, and so on. So those are the two things that really influence the kind of language that we develop. And when you kind of mesh those two in, when you live in a plural society like ours, we borrow words, right, from each other. I don't need to get into, some of those examples, but I think we're all aware of them. But at the same time, culture is always transforming. So while we're borrowing, words and so on from others, we're interacting. Sometimes, words can also be used in a sense to exclude ourselves from others. So essentially, we're looking at, a couple of things here when we talk about language. On the one hand, it can be used to kind of create a sort of an intra-ethnic community to keep people close together, right? So that they can kind of, in a sense, vote en masse in a block for a candidate who may represent that community, right? So you have that whole notion of nationalism. We see a lot of these colonial movement that was based on nationalism, but sometimes that nationalism will include other communities. In the case of Guyana, Africans, Indians, Portuguese, and so on, because those are the people who live in these plural societies, right? So you have that whole notion of language being used to bring people together. Secondly, it can also be used to exclude others because you want to keep your community together. So you use language and words that keep you together as a group. And of course, the other element, which I guess we should be concerned about now, is the use of language as a disruptive factor. In other words, if we're saying that we live in a plural society, we have to be very mindful of the kind of language that we use. And I guess we're having this discussion here today because of the language. I know, David is not here, to defend himself, but I would argue that what David was trying to do is to create that intra-ethnic unity, right? But I think where it spills over into broader society and it becomes dangerous is when you start addressing others and using that kind of language. Look, I think all of us here can agree. This is a new kind of a rhetoric we're seeing, right? Barnum in his more erudite, Churchillian lifestyle would use words like balderdash, Tommy Rut, right? I don't remember ever that Chetty kind of used any of those words, even in his most depressed moment, depressed in the sense of political pressure. Rodney has been a little choice with his words, yeah, but it wasn't in a sense where you use those words, to put down people, right? And of course, Quina, I've never heard Quina used anything that comes close to the kind of language that we're using here today. So I'm going to end with this. What I'm saying is the language can be used as a unifying force. And I think that's To be fair to David, he has always said that I am speaking on behalf of African. I can understand that. I can rationalize with that, right? But in our society, in our political climate, it can be a very disruptive force. And I think this is what you're seeing. So you have people who would support what was said, and then there are those who would oppose, right, for different reasons. So I'm going to leave it at that.
Um, Dr. Campbell, you want to amplify that, add to it?
Thank you, Dr. Bisram, and much thanks again for inviting me to join the panel on this occasion. Before I respond to Beto, does anybody call you Beto? Can I just say Beto?
Yeah, everybody does.
Okay, great. Before I respond to Beto, when the advertisement for this program went out, as usual, my practice is in business. So my consumers, my customers would communicate with me. And immediately I got a message saying, as usual, an all-male panel. So understand that my practice is business. And there was a second message saying, you guys need to discuss femicide, the domestic intimate partner violence, domestic violence, the killing of our women in particular. So it would be remiss of me as a businessman not to pass on the comments of my customers to you. So maybe we would want to address Globespan. And I don't know that I'm an expert in any of those areas, but maybe Globespan will want to address those, to diversify the panel. I can't disagree with the fact that we are 5 men here on discussing a subject. I know DEI is dying in the US, but let's keep it alive in Guyana. So maybe we would want to diversify the panel, and also at some point maybe add well, it's not even recent, but intimate partner violence as a topic for this discussion. Let me turn to the comments of Beto on the use of language to herd supporters in some ways, and to distance. I think we have examples of the use of this language going back maybe for as long as we've been independent, and even prior to that independence. It was interesting that I saw a video here in the US of a pastor delivering a very impassioned sermon. And he was doing nothing different, I think, from what David did, but just in much more Churchillian, if I'm to borrow your expression, Churchillian language. I think we have to just to examine the use of the language itself, jarring as it was. I do believe that to some degree, we're all in some ways national figures. We're pretty well known to a large proportion of the Guyanese populace. And we have to be careful with the language that we use, even if the intent might be pure. And I'm going to wrap this up because I know you said 3 minutes. Beto has previously written in an exchange, I don't know if he remembers, but he replied to a comment of mine, and he spoke about stuff like affirmative action and so on. And I would say that what we lack in Guyana is systems to address inequality and inequity. Whether we look at it from a ethnicity point of view, or we look at it from a class point of view, we lack those systems. And what we've seen in recent times is political parties using the financial resources of the state to determine or to address some of those inequities albeit in a very terrible way. And to my mind, that was the issue that David really meant to address. And I'm not justifying his language, but he really meant to address the issue of political parties avoiding systematic prescriptions and instead using the resources of the state to determine who will be able to avail themselves of resources or even be able to avail themselves of charges being dropped. And that is concerning. I think I never followed up on the last exchange that Beto and I had. It wasn't a big exchange, but I never followed up on it. I think if there were systematic distribution of resources, then there will be less need for us to use the kind of language that we've seen emerge in the public domain. So that's my take on it, that we cannot look at the language in isolation. We have to look at what is happening behind the language. I mean, I'm sitting amongst academics here. So in other words, I'm asking for a critical analysis of what's really behind the use of this language.
Ravindra Dev.
Mr. Dev, you're on mute.
Yeah. Let me put what I think is the context within which David spoke. Vincent, myself, Beto, and David were on a program right here on Globespan. And the topic was basically mobilization strategies in terms of the upcoming elections. And in fact, in that first program where David made his outburst, he referred to Beto and myself in that program, and Vincent. And the way I get it, because this is nothing new. In fact, Leyland Ryan just said when he saw myself and Vincent discussing this topic, he said, you all gote the same thing. Now, I don't know if everybody would know the word gote, but when you make dal, at the end of the process, you swizzle it, and then you break up the dal, and it's a very tedious process. So you're in a sense agitating the same thing again and again, and that's what Leyland is accusing us of, that we're goteing, agitating this subject all the time, and to what end? Well, the end, and I would like to make this very, very pertinent here, and that Vincent will follow me, and I hope he can pick up from here, which is that when we talk about rhetoric and racial rhetoric, in Guyana, we are primarily talking of it within a political context. And I'm not making just a throwaway comment that everything is politics. I'm making a specific charge here that it becomes a problem when we speak about race in the political mobilization process. So what we had come out 30 years ago when we came on the scene in Guyana, and we talked about the fact that race was being used as a basis for mobilization. And even before our time was used by Mr. Burnham and Dr. Jagan, we pointed out the fact that they didn't create race or create ethnicity. It was there, but in a rational sense, they utilized those categories for mobilizing it, because those categories go to the whole notion of identity as to how people, categorize themselves, saw themselves. So it's very important that we go back to that race and ethnicity as categories was part of the Guyanese subjectivity before modern politics, but all the politicians within a democratic regime, when you're supposed to agglomerate numbers to gain legitimacy, they utilized it. And of course, would do everything in their power to say, no, 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 we're not doing it. Both the early ones called themselves socialists, which abhorred, the whole notion of race/ethnicity. And in fact, I always bring up this incident when in '77, Dr. Jagan, when they were talking about coalescing with the PNC, and he brought up the notion of PNC racism against Indians. Mr. Burnham slyly asked him, comrade, what is the socialist content of race? And, he stumped Dr. Jagan, what could you say? Because they were both supposed to be above that. But to come back to our thing, our problem, and we discuss it, and I'm going to close here, was that we have pointed out that Guyana is now a nation of minorities. Therefore, that implies a whole different political logic, and I say political logic, than what came before during Mr. Burnham and Dr. Jagan's time. The logic now is that for any one group to gain democratic legitimacy at the polls, they must reach across the divides. They must reach across the divides to garner those quote unquote outside votes to get that 50% plus one. And my problem with David, as I said then, and I'll say now, and I said it in the press, is that for the people who David is agitating for, African Guyanese, the party to which they have traditionally given their support to, he doesn't do that party any favor by cussing out those Africans who want to go across the divide to vote for someone else. Because, as I said, in a like manner, those who cross from that side to the PNC side can then be accused of the same thing. And therefore, we are not going forward. In a word, we should now be practicing what we have labeled as centripetal politics, where the politics we practice must bring the people together and not centrifugal politics, which the words and the rhetoric we use should divide them.
Okay. Do you have anything to say?
I didn't hear, but I presume I have been asked to comment. Whenever we talk about ethnicity, the question of language becomes a critical question. For the simple reason that when one seeks to determine the elements of an ethnic group, language is one of those elements, and in many regards is a major element. My own life experience with language was when I was a student in my early 20s, very early 20s, in Tanzania, Africa. And a secondary school student, in conversing with me, asked me what was my mother tongue. At that time, I said, we speak English. And his response was, we all speak English. What's your mother tongue? And I was awakened at that time to the fact that language has a lot to do with identity. Language is associated with identity. And I became appreciative at that time of Creolese, which I might have been critical of prior to, because it helped to give me identity in a community that was multi-ethnic. If I didn't have that identity, then I would not attract regard and respect. Now, the fact of the matter is that language really is the expression and in many regards the custodian of one's culture. In a poor society, Then you have different cultures or subcultures, you might want to call them, as much as there is some degree of universality in society as well. And so language, to a very large extent, is used on one hand for ethnic expression, whereas on the other hand, it is used for unification. So it serves two purposes. Ravi would say that is the unity of opposites. Language, on one hand, serve the purpose of identifying diversity, representing diversity. On the other hand, unification. So that one has to look at the use of language in the context of the particular level, whether it's the universal level or whether it's the level of the particular ethnic group. Now, we are discussing this against the backdrop of what David would have said in relation to and I must confess, in that regard, I will not generalize. I can particularize, and I can understand where David was going in the use of language in that circumstance. I myself might not use those terms, but I certainly understand where he was going. I understand it because I understand the character who he sought to describe. I understand that character. I'm not going to go into that here. No. My understanding of that character suggests to me that David was not using language in general terms, in terms of necessarily categories of people of African descent. He was using that language in very specific reference to a particular person based on how that person could be characterized. As I said, I might have used different terms, probably mean the same thing. Historiography of that person's involvement in politics could easily bring one to that kind of characterization. And I think that is what influenced David, though his language may have been a little on the extreme side. I think that is essentially, and I don't see that language creating difficulties across the ethnic divide. I see that language being very, very specific in this instance to intra-ethnic relations, and the extent to which David has not himself originated those terms, the extent to which in the intra-ethnic, in the ethnic group, there is that kind of characterization. Because as language, as a custodian of culture, it's also a custodian of legacy. And I rather suspect that David was bringing forward in some regards legacy, the legacy of the language in that usage, since it's not what is generally used these days, but certainly bringing forward the legacy to express an understanding of the situation in a manner that was extremely picturesque. So in a manner that would certainly have two responses. A response which says, look, I understand what this man is talking about. Another response which says, why has he gone that level in terms of the use of language? And in some regards, one can relate that to class within a particular ethnic group, and a recognition that there are those who are least inclined to use the Queen's language and does not see the Queen's language as representing true expression of their thoughts, as opposed to those who will use the Queen's language, having been, in some regards, a contributor.
Okay, so I think we have beaten up Dave enough now, and if we may, part of um, racial rhetoric in Guyana. Aside from David, there would have been others as well who use languages that is positive, negative. Dr. Betram, illustrations of others that you think were used and that may be used in the upcoming elections?
Well, if my dearly departed mother was here with us today, she would have used the word nimakaram. That would have been as namakaram, meaning, salt, and haram has its basis in the Islamic tradition, meaning you're using that term to describe someone who is ungrateful. And I'm sure she would have used that in reference to Moses Nagamutu and Kamraj Ramjatan if she was here, because she's a Barbitian and she would have understood, a person who was connected to the sugar estate, she would have understood, the problem that they created. I'm not trying to correct that problem. But look,
but
but
you are referring, she would have felt, and my mother also would have felt as a Barbitian, that she betrayed the party. She betrayed. They betrayed the party. They betrayed the race. Would I right?
Yes, and that's and that's the problem we're trying to deal with here. I agree with Vincent when he says the language and the rhetoric, can be used to unify people. Yeah, fair enough. It can be used to express a diverse culture and so on. But the problem is when you step out of that line, and if you recall, Cherry was very much critical in his book, about people, Indians, who he dubbed as people who were using the term Panjat, right? But again, we're far away from that. I think that I don't have a problem when you use a language to keep people together, to unify people. But it goes beyond unifying and it goes beyond cultural expression, because we have to look at things in context. David is a politician. He's not one of us discussing things here, but he's deep into the politics. He wants to change public policy. So when you go out of that boundary and you now target others and you call them names like slave catchers and so on, in my mind, you're also saying that the Indians who would support the WPA or the PNC fall into those categories. And I think that's where it becomes troublesome. It is for that reason why you would have people like James Bond and Jermaine Figueroa and Royal Johnson and so on would say, look, this is not the language we need at this time. But I want to zero in, because we're talking about rhetoric here. I want to make an important point. Well, in my head, I think is important, where language can become dangerous. In 2015, there were a number of reasons why APNU actually won that election, APNU AFC, because when you look at what they have done, there were three things to me that stands out. One is this whole notion of establishing a coalition, because you're saying, look, I'm a stronger opposition because we're made up of many different groups, right? Moses brought in his 11% or whatever. The second element that was there was the whole notion that Granger eschew protests. In other words, every time you have a street protest, we know who gets beat up is Indians. So he put a stop to that. So you have coalition, you have an end to street protest. And what is also important is the rhetoric. He wasn't saying more fire, slow fire. Granger used a different kind of language. And those three things, together, in a sense, propel them into power, right? So language is crucial. But here's the other point I do want to make when it comes to rhetoric and voting behavior, right? when we use language to debase people, right? Certain kinds of words, that is. Um, and I know I saw Leland Sowell's defense, but he was cherry picking the words that David actually used. What I'm saying here is this: we can't assume that in an election, because they may vote for ANOG or or the PPP or PNC or whatever, voters are making rational selection. They are going to the poll. They did that here in the United States. A lot of people don't like Trump, but they voted for him because they figure that that is the person who will safeguard their political interests. So therefore, when you criticize people, as James Wan had pointed out, who in a sense would now support the PPP, you're seeing that they're making an irrational choice, right? Secondly, voters, because they're rational, they vote for their own interests. Now, we don't know what's the reason behind, young Africans who really don't care much, from my own experience visiting Guyana, right? Why they're tilting towards the PPP. There are resources that they have, right? There are opportunities that are there. And there are many Africans who could probably, look at Terence as a role model and become powerful business folks, right? And I think that the third issue here, when we start criticizing those who are now saying, look, we're going to vote for the other side, you're in a sense promoting a level of disunity, right? A disunity in the sense that your language is now going to be much more radicalized, is going to be weaponized. In other words, instead of going forward, instead of looking to a society that we can build and live in together, you want to always go back. So in a sense, you're ignoring that historical past, right? And I think those things are crucial. When the rhetoric goes, haywire, you're throwing all of this into a spoke. So I was saying, look, we don't need, for me as an Indian, if I was voting, right, in November, my question would be, look, you have David Hines, you have Nigel Hughes, you have Norton. Which one of these guys will represent an Indian interest, right? Are they going to do the same thing that they have done when they were in power? So those are legitimate questions I will ask. And as Mr. Dev is saying, in a society where Indians are not in the majority, right? We are a party of minorities. You have to go out there to compete to get that 50 plus 1%. You're not, making it easier for the opposition to get to that point. So this all, in a sense, sounds like lunacy when you really put it all together and look at this historical era in which we're in.
Dr. Campbell, you want to comment on that?
Yeah. First, the topic was use and impact of racial rhetoric in Guyanese society. And the racial rhetoric goes way beyond the political sphere, but I noticed that we're kind of focused on the politics, I guess, because this is an election year. Just to build up on what I was saying and just to address some of the points that have been raised. And I don't think that this is dissimilar from the experience of any other ethnicity, but at least those of African descent have always had language or rhetoric to describe certain behavior. Here in the US, there's a phrase called coon, which is not dissimilar from the language that we find David has used. It may be a little more palatable, I don't know, but as I said, David's language was jarring. I do agree with Beto that as national leaders, and this dovetails with the point that Ravi made, that we are all minorities. As national leaders, we have to be careful with the language that we use. So an African leader, the question that Beto would ask himself as an Indo-Guyanese, which one of the, is there, let me phrase it another way, is there an African, let's suppose Beto is an Indo-Guyanese who is unhappy with the current administration. Then he will ask himself, is there a leader from any of the other parties with whom I think can represent my interests? And I would rather say that the rational person would not necessarily say my interest as an Indo-Guyanese, but represent the interests of all Guyanese. And so national leaders have got to ensure that the language that they use is reassuring to all ethnicities. You have got to be very, very careful that whatever language they use it's reassuring to all ethnicities, that you are going to look out for their interests. But I must go back again to the issue, and Vincent really said he understand. He kind of indicated like it was a singular example that David was referring to, and I don't think it was a singular example. And you have to forgive me, because my training is business and insurance, and I look for the proximate cause. There is absolutely nothing wrong with Indo-Guyanese supporting. We have got to evolve to the point where Indo-Guyanese can support any party of their choice. The same thing for Afro-Guyanese and so on. But for me, the proximate cause that drove David to that statement, it was, and Beto referred to resources, it was the diabolical use of resources to attract African Guyanese to this current leadership. It is not as if David was not, I don't think he was singular in his reference, it was plural, but it was not of a class of people. It was maybe of just a few people whom he felt were being attracted by a diabolical use of resources. And that is an issue that I think we should not leave alone as we discuss language and racial rhetoric in our society. So I'll come back to the point. I'll summarize by saying that as national leaders, we must be careful in our language. Our language must reassure all ethnicities in Guyana that we will look out for their interests, right? It's important that national parties operate in this way. But I will take the time, I must take the time to criticize vehemently the diabolical use of state resources to attract different ethnicities to different parties. And it may reverse if there's another administration, they may do it. And that is what I will call out, because I think that's the proximate cause that led David to address a few individuals.
Ravi Dev.
Mr. Dev, you're on mute.
I'd like to be, like Vincent, I'd like to be a bit concrete in my reply, because this isn't just theory. Back when the PNC had been in the wilderness since 1992, I came out in 2001, launched a party, and got into parliament in 2001. And people forget I was part of the opposition. I sat as a member of the opposition. I spoke as a member of the opposition. We met as a member of the opposition. I encountered Vincent in some of those meetings, albeit that he was treated rather shabbily in some of those meetings by members of the PNC, but that's neither here nor there. But I was a member of the opposition. So by the time 2009 rolled around, the votes that Roar had accumulated in the 2006 election had nominated a fellow by the name of Everett Franklin, an Afro-Guyanese, to represent Roar Gap, or Gap Roar. We were a coalition. And that was when Robert floated the notion of having a coalition. And, Everett spoke to me, and we were always, our side, Roar, Beto, myself, and others, always felt that you need a viable opposition in any democracy. That's fundamental. If you don't have a viable opposition, whoever is in power they'll ride roughshod over not only their opponents, but over the people eventually. Therefore, it is in the interest of all citizens in Guyana for us to have a viable opposition. And it is in that context I spoke up then that the PNC and the opposition and the new group that was going to be formed should take a moderate tone. Because as early as then, we had seen the demographics change, that we were heading towards a minority of groups. None of them could capture the state on their own. And therefore, we felt, and you can go back to the record, it's all there in the press. And by 2009, we had said that PNC must reinvent itself, even change its name to become, and we quoted the first Bush, a kinder, gentler party, as at least present itself to get rid of that image that it had, which drove away other groups from it. And lo and behold, as they say in biblical circles, the name was changed. Against people like my friend Eric Phillips, Lincoln Lewis, castigated me for wanting to destroy African Guyanese because I rejected that the PNC should come back into the streets to take on the PPP. And so that new grouping held its those imperatives back, and they checkmated the PPP in 2011 and defeated the PPP in 2015. And again, I will say this, I was very happy because I felt at long last our plural society was practicing the politics of in and out. And the next step we would get to was that we would be voting for parties on matters of competence as to who develops the country more, who is more equitable in distribution, and all of those questions that regular garden variety politics practices. But lo and behold, I don't want to belabor the point. I think Mr. Granger made a mistake in shuttering the estate. Therefore, he could be accused then of running roughshod over Indo-Guyanese that put him over the tape at that point. So I want to return to where I stand, that at the rhetoric we're talking about, and to support what I think Terence is saying here, that leaders are not followers. Leaders have an extra burden, I would say, if it is that. They have that responsibility, and if it is a burden, so be it, to watch their tongue. And it's not a matter of class, I would respectfully say to Vincent. Back in around 2003 or 4, Mr. Quayana, who is certainly not, class-oriented by then, he and I had a bit of a debate in the press about my use of the word bastard. I defined the mulattoes as bastards, and I said they were official bastards. But I use the term in sense of castigating them for looking down on the ordinary Africans. Because as I said, again, concretely, I sat, when at Mr. Hoyt's funeral, I sat on the balcony of Parliament buildings and saw the mulatto elites around me who were in Parliament sneer and castigate African Guyanese who were behaving in what they said was an unruly manner in support of Mr. Hoyt. But to come back to the point I want to again reiterate, yes, Terence, we are talking about politics because this year is, I think going to determine where we go. And your concern about the use of state resources to get votes, call it buy votes or attract votes or what have you, that's always going to be the case in so-called democratic societies. So we do not have to give such parties in power, all incumbent parties, we don't have to give them extra ammo. And I think if the leaders don't watch their words, we are doing just that. Thank you.
Leaders have
This discussion is suggesting David is presenting himself nation. And my own view is that at least in recent times, David has presented himself as the mobilizer of a tribe rather than the mobilizer of votes or elections. Though the mobilization of the tribe may well be related to the mobilization of votes. One has to, in some regards, see David from that perspective, the mobilizer of a tribe and the tribe together. And in reference to Bond, one has to also recognize the language which Bond uses. Whenever Bond spoke, and I have heard interviews with Bond, the one with Burke, Bond didn't speak of himself, often spoke of we, so that Bond sought to project himself as a person who has made a personal decision on matters. There's someone who reflects how the we are thinking, how the we are doing. I think that in many regards, Davis was stripping Bond of his we, saying, no, this is not about we, it's about you and your disposition. In a society where, and I think Terence made this point, whilst we are seeking to particularize the rhetoric as political, I don't think that we could necessarily do that. Because the ethnic rhetoric has a depth beyond politics. And the fact of the matter is that while David may have engaged in this rhetoric on a platform that's national, if one were to look at social media, this rhetoric proliferates social media, and it's across the ethnic divide. This proliferation is across the ethnic divide. So that in some regards, this rhetoric is a representation of the problem that we have. So in that regard, I would say, yes, one has to, if one is a national leader, seek not to become involved in that manner. But this rhetoric is a representation of the national problem that we have. And it's not peculiar to David Hines, though David may have brought it to a certain level in terms of the audience that is supposed to. But if one checks social media, one will see that this rhetoric is in fact what is pervasive, and therefore it's an indication of one of the problems that we are faced with, and one of the problems that we've got to overcome. And to overcome it, first of all, by a recognition of diversity and a respect of people for who they are. And that is what brings us into the question of Bond's we versus the me, because there's a representation here by Bond of who David is challenging him in that regard and saying, you're not speaking for my people. And I think David will actually use those words, my people. You're speaking for yourself and people like you, not my people. I think that's a part of the contextualization of what we are confronted with. And so in many regards, I still contend that even if I don't embrace David's language, his language was more inward looking in terms of the ethnic group than outward looking, and was not necessarily a characterization of anyone else outside of the ethnic group, and more particularly a categorization of bond. Now, I think we ought to bear in mind also that language is but one form of communication, and that David here has resorted to language, was that in Guyana, in terms of intra-ethnic communication, there are other things which are used, which probably are far more vital than any language that we have experienced in communicating inwardly to a group in an attempt to harness, in a sense, that group. And one cannot ignore that phenomenon in our society, that there are other forms of communication, vile and sometimes violent, which are used to the intra-ethnic exchange, harness the ethnic group.
Yeah, I don't think anyone will dispute that that David was referring to members of the intra group, and I think Dr. Ramrak made reference to that before as well. So if we may close off now, Dr. Ramrak, any final comments about um, ethnic rhetoric, racial rhetoric? This is an election season, and all election season in Guyana by both dominant political parties used racial rhetoric for intertribal unity.
Well, two quick points. One is that I want to come back to, the three things that I mentioned that propel, APNO into office, right? APNO being the larger party. Again, the whole notion of the tempered rhetoric, the whole notion of having a coalition of forces, and the avoidance of street protests, right? Those three elements, as far as we can tell, do not exist today. The rhetoric is very inflamed. The coalition of opposition do not exist, right? And I think what is going to happen is that you may end up seeing attempts to get people onto the streets to do maybe something, that were done to Janet Jagan's tenure, to cut back on the tenure. I'm just saying that could be a scenario. But my main point here is that the conditions that we would hope that exist that cause APNU to win in a fair way, 2015, do not exist. So that creates a level of anxiety, right, for this upcoming election. And adding, the rhetoric to this, in this environment will create problems. And again, I make the point, yes, I accept the fact that David, who incidentally is not here, the whole show is about him, unfortunately. I accept the fact that, yes, you are speaking, as he said before, for Africans, right? He's not speaking for Indians or Portuguese, and I respect that. But I think when that crosses the boundary, it becomes a problem. But here's the other point I really want to make. This is a discussion. And by the way, Vincent, it's not just James Bond, the I. There's also a we. There are others involved who took issue. And I mentioned Ruel Johnson and, Leonard Craig and others, right? So there's a concern there. But this is the point I want to make. This is an important discussion that is taking place among Africans, right? Primarily Africans. And Indians will have their say. Once in a while, they will have their comment. They will make the comment. But it's not a discussion among the Indian community. And I've always made this point, and I know this has always raised people's eyebrows, that the PPP is the political vehicle for Indians. It is not the organization that represents Indians. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that it's not like, a situation where IPADA represents many African groups. We don't have, Indians that is, don't have an organization that can encourage this kind of discussion and debates within the Indian community. And to me, that is, that is a legacy we need to build on. So that discussion could continue within the African community, and it will only make that community much stronger, right? Hopefully. But I would like to see that kind of discussion also take place among Indians, because most Indians assume that the PPP is their organization, but there are issues that this political party will not address when it comes to Indians. So when we make the argument, always make the argument that the PPP is an Indian, organization, which is an argument that's always being made, by people like David and so on and others. You ignore the fact that this is an organization that has refused to address Indian concern. The kind of discussion we could have here, right, with Terence and Vincent and David and so on. You don't have that kind of discussion among leaders within the political party. So that means that there's something wrong here. So if we're going to have a national dialogue, that dialogue should also take place within that community. And I'm going to end with this, right? I know Terence is concerned about state resource and so on, but we have always proposed, we talk about affirmative action and so on, but we have always proposed what we call a sort of a caucus, right? A caucus that exists just in a similar way you have a Hispanic caucus or a Black caucus, in Congress. If we were to have that, a caucus that represents Indian interests, and that can be a sort of advisory arm, right, to whether it's the APNU or PPP in power, then we may go a long way towards addressing those those ethnic concerns, right, those cultural concerns that we have. We don't currently have that, and I think that's a shortcoming. And I do believe that that's something that's going to be helpful and useful.
So politicians have used irresponsible language, rhetoric. How are we going to stop that? I just don't see it as being practical in Guyana, because it appeals to the base, it appeals to the tribe in order to garner votes. And it has worked. It has worked historically, and I'm sure it's going to work this year as well. Dr. Terence.
Let me say that I take slight issue with Beto when he says that the conditions do not exist. I'm not sure if I got you correctly for maybe a coalition victory in this election.
Well, we're not seeing it yet. Maybe we have time, so maybe that may emerge at some point.
Well, I believe there's a lot of discontent, even amongst traditional PPP supporters, that can be exploited. And in relation to Ravi, I think Ravi attempted to defang my comment on diabolical use, but let me just particularize it in around, and I didn't want to do this in around James Bond, but it's my considered opinion that the criminal charges hanging over his head would have played some part in his current support for the PPP. And I believe if my assumption or my opinion is correct, then that's a diabolical use. We know that the chief has said that there's no quid pro quo, but I don't believe that. And so it's some of these, when I say diabolical, I'm not talking about, to my mind, it's okay. Go build roads all over the country and so on at around election time. Build new, in the olden days, used to be build a new roundabout to win the election. That's fine. But I'm talking about something far more insidious. But just to wrap up on the issue of, from a practical perspective, I think that in a national leader from our First Peoples, right, would have to be the pressure to be politically correct, to be unifying in language, would be greater than a national leader from our Afro-Guyanese community, and consequently from a national leader in our Indo-Guyanese community. We have seen at least one leader in the Indo-Guyanese community who has never restrained himself from the use of racial rhetoric. And I think that's because we don't have the benefit of a census, but that's because he is closer to that tape than the national leaders from the other ethnicities. I say all of this to say, and I hope that there are national leaders from those ethnicities that are smaller in number to understand that it becomes even more important that your language be unifying. And it would be remiss of me to say this without saying that once in power, your policies must be unifying, because language is form, but the substance must follow. So I'm calling on all national leaders. I don't think racial rhetoric in the political season is what we need, and I condemn it. But I think the pressure, I want to remind those of us who are from ethnicities that are perhaps not the largest in number, to be exceptionally careful in the use of our language. And when we have the victory, when there is a change in government, to make sure that the policies follow the unifying language that we use to get there.
Lovely. Ravindra Dev.
You're muted, Ravi.
Yeah, Terence has made it a bit easy for me to offer my summation. There was another Terence on this program, Dr. Terence Blackman. And Dr. Blackman once spoke about us looking at each other as tribes, and that we need to start to look at ourselves as a Guyanese tribe. And within the tribe, you will have differences, but we have to begin to look at ourselves as the Guyanese tribe. Vincent talked about the language you use, the Creole language you use, as we call it in the countryside, to speak Brakup. It's always noteworthy. You viewers out there in social media land might know, but before these programs, most of us, we have a chat, and invariably, as is this evening, when we chat not in this standard stilted English. We are all chatting in our local language. I'm a fellow from IFLUT. I understand Terence is out from Essequibo. Was that Queenstown, right?
Queenstown.
Kimani is from Queenstown also.
He's my villager.
But look at that. So come back to the point, I think we need to begin to craft a language that represents that. Because we are supposed to be leaders, and I'm not bigging ourselves up, but if people see us as opinion leaders and we take the lead in using this kind of language of togetherness and all that on this national endeavor, because it is a national endeavor, I think we will be building a real beautiful land of Guyana. The last thing I want to conclude on is that when I heard David speak, and David and I go back over 30 years, I once offered David in 1999, when the troubles were happening, why don't he and I link up and launch a party? That's before ROAR was formed, and David can talk about that. So we go a way back. That he spoke of something to me which was insidious, which is that he was condemning, he intimated that those blacks who joined with the PPP, they had to, I think he used the word acculturate or assimilate, somehow that Africans who join the PPP have to change who they are. And I think that is something that needs to be examined and explored, because we can be united, but we must maintain our unique attributes that has been historically formed. And for anyone to ask an African, whether African Guyanese or African who, after what Africans have gone through historically, to ignore their quote-unquote Africanness, I think is not only doing an injustice, but is doing a very violent act of almost, diremption, splitting you apart. So to conclude, I would say that if we want to go forward, we must begin to speak a common language. And I'll end with a concrete example, that when I tried to form something called a center force back in 2005, not the third force, implying that you're less than the others, you're a center, meaning you'll stand for Guyana. And we had all of the small parties the WPA, the NASCENT, AFC, and everybody who was anybody in that grouping who were not PPP or PNC. And we proposed that Paul Hardy, the Amerindian, going back to Terence's point, be the leader. That at long last we would have a leader who is neither African nor Indian and who could, at some level, speak ontologically as a true Guyanese, because we can't dispute that. And I'll tell you this, and I'll close with this. That was knocked down, and I could see then the racism in those who stood and sat around that table. Paul wasn't fit. I leave.
Vincent, word.
In closing, language and its rhetoric is not the problem, nor is it the determining factor in terms of the solution. It reflects the problem, but it's not in itself the problem. Though in structural arrangements, sometimes superstructural elements can become dominant at a particular point in time. Can never, ever be the determining factor in the resolution of the issues. So that as we look future for Guyana, we have to seriously look beyond the rhetoric to what is the determining factor, because that is where ultimately the solution has to be found. David is not here, but I'm quite sure David will argue this point. That for him, it's not a matter of who wins or who loses the elections, because the present electoral and governance configuration is not what will create the kind of Guyana that we're looking for, where there is inclusion and where there is unity. And therefore, the issue is not about winning elections. And so, rhetoric that this may cause people to distance themselves is not a problem. What is critical is that the various groups, solidified as they are, should then come to the understanding of the need to work across the divide as diverse groups, as part of one whole system. And in that regard, seek to bring to bear the being, the desires and aspirations of each group onto the national platform in the search for a solution. So winning and losing really is no big thing. You win, you lose, Guyana remains the same. What is required is to go beyond our present configuration, electoral and otherwise, to have that kind of inclusivity, some people call it power sharing, allow for all expressions to be brought onto the board, and for those things which are common to be dealt with commonly, and those things which are diverse to be dealt with diverse.
I don't think anyone will disagree with those final points. Thank you, Vincent Alexander, Dr. Betram Rarak, Dr. Terence Campbell, Ravindra Dev. Thank you, viewers and listeners, for joining us tonight. I think it was a very, very, very discussion, and I hope we have more of these, and that Dr. Terence Campbell will join us more often for discussion of other subjects and topics as well. Thank you, gentlemen. Very, very valid point. We do need some females on this program and to discuss topics that impact and affect our female community in Guyana and in the diaspora. Good night, all.
Thank you.
All right.